Imagine standing on a battlefield where every second could be your last. Smoke curls in the air, the ground shakes with the thunder of distant artillery, and your men cling desperately to trenches and foxholes. You've trained for years, studied maps, mastered strategy, yet the enemy's firepower is unlike anything you have ever faced. It is precise, relentless, and utterly devastating. For Japan's top generals during World War II, this was not a nightmare in theory. It was their reality. Visual: black and white footage of Pacific Islands, Japanese troops running, explosions tearing through fortifications. One general would later admit, in a rare post-battle statement, "We had underestimated them until the shells rained down, and it was far too late to retreat or regroup." Another wrote in his diary that American tanks and artillery were a storm we could not withstand, an inferno that no amount of courage could temper. These statements, recorded only after the battles were lost, reveal a brutal truth: Japan's military brilliance and years of experience were no match for the sheer industrial and tactical might of the United States. Visual: reenactment of generals studying maps in dimly lit war rooms, smoke rising from distant explosions outside. This is not just a story of soldiers on a battlefield, it is the story of men who commanded thousands, who strategized with precision, and yet were forced to confront a devastating realization: their planning, their discipline, their experience could not withstand the firepower arrayed against them. Visual: slow-motion shots of Japanese bunkers being shelled, soldiers diving for cover. The Pacific War was a collision between traditional military doctrine and modern industrial warfare. Japanese generals were no strangers to combat. They had led campaigns across Asia, from China to Southeast Asia, often achieving victory through speed, coordination, and tactical brilliance. But the Americans were different. They brought massive firepower, sustained artillery, coordinated airstrikes, and armored divisions that could crush defensive lines before the defenders could react. Visual: archival footage of U.S. tanks rolling, aircraft soaring, naval bombardments. On islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, the difference became horrifyingly clear. Japanese positions, carefully fortified and meticulously planned, crumbled under a storm of shells, bombs, and gunfire. Soldiers who believed their foxholes and bunkers were safe were suddenly exposed to fire that was precise and unrelenting. Visual: explosions ripping through sandbags, soldiers being thrown off balance, close-ups of terrified faces. Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, who would later command the defense of Iwo Jima, documented the fear and disbelief in his private notes. "Our calculations, our plans, they were insufficient. Every position we held was vulnerable. Every assumption we had made about the enemy was proven wrong within hours of their landing." Visual: slow pan over maps with troop positions marked, juxtaposed with American landing craft approaching beaches. The shock was not only in the scale of destruction but in its speed. American forces, leveraging superior artillery and air support, could obliterate defensive positions faster than Japanese commanders could react. Entire squads vanished under bombardments, and the surviving troops were forced into desperate, isolated pockets of resistance. Visual: cratered beaches, destroyed bunkers, abandoned weapons, and smoke rising in the distance. But the human element made the experience even more harrowing. Japanese soldiers, trained in discipline and loyalty, fought with valor. They were prepared to die for their country and their commanders, yet the generals knew that courage alone could not counter the relentless power of the American war machine. Diaries and memoirs reveal the psychological toll on commanders who watched thousands of lives vanish in minutes. Visual: close-up of Japanese soldiers in trenches, shaking hands, reading letters, faces tense and worried. General Keiji Shibazaki, killed at Tarawa, wrote chillingly in a report to his superiors, "We had fortified every corner, every bunker, yet it was as if our defenses did not exist. Their guns struck with a precision we had never imagined. Men fell by dozens in minutes, and there was nothing we could do." Visual: dramatic reenactments of bunkers collapsing under fire, soldiers being pulled to safety, smoke clouds expanding. The clash of cultures, strategy, and technology became apparent almost immediately. Japanese doctrine emphasized ingenuity, defensive positioning, and morale, relying on well-trained soldiers and clever tactics rather than sheer destructive capability. The Americans, however, applied industrial-scale production, combined arms coordination, and overwhelming firepower that rendered traditional tactics obsolete. Visual: pan over American factories, tanks rolling off assembly lines, planes taking off in squadrons. And yet, the generals did not immediately accept this reality. Early reports of American industrial capacity, numbers of troops, and weaponry were often dismissed as exaggeration. But experience quickly proved otherwise. Battles across the Pacific exposed a horrifying reality. The Americans were capable of sustained bombardments, relentless offensives, and rapid reinforcement in ways that Japan could not match. Visual: historical footage of the U.S. Navy firing from ships, planes dropping bombs, waves of troops advancing. The personal accounts of these generals make it clear how devastating this revelation was. Some wrote of nights spent pacing bunkers, trying to calculate how to defend against overwhelming firepower, only to realize the numbers and logistics made it impossible. Others noted the terror in the eyes of their troops, and themselves, as artillery shells and bombs reduced years of preparation to rubble. This chapter of history is a study in hindsight and regret. Words spoken by Japanese commanders after the battles reveal a bitter acknowledgement. We understood the scale of the enemy's power only after it had already destroyed us. It is a reminder that strategy alone cannot overcome the unyielding force of industrialized warfare, no matter the courage or skill of those involved. And it is here, in these personal reflections, that we begin to see the human story behind the statistics. Thousands of soldiers died not simply because of bravery or cowardice, but because their commanders could not anticipate the destructive capabilities of the enemy. The shock, disbelief, and horror they experienced became etched in history through these candid accounts. Visual: soldiers running across coral beaches, shells exploding, smoke billowing, commanders shouting orders. In the chapters that follow, we will dive deeper into how these generals' assumptions were shattered, how specific battles unfolded under unprecedented American firepower, and what lessons, if any, were learned too late. You will see the clash of tradition and modernity, strategy and reality, courage and firepower, all converging on islands scattered across the Pacific Ocean. By the end of this journey, you will understand why these generals' words, spoken after it was too late, resonate with both historians and strategists today. Their experiences reveal not only the horrors of war, but the limits of human planning against an industrialized war machine. It is a story of shock, humility, and the sobering consequences of underestimating an enemy. This is just the opening, a glimpse into the stark reality faced by Japanese commanders who, despite experience and strategy, discovered that courage alone could not withstand the unstoppable force of American firepower. Before the devastation of Tarawa, Saipan, or Iwo Jima, the Japanese generals believed they were prepared for war. Their strategy was rooted in decades of military tradition, discipline, and experience across Asia. By 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army had expanded rapidly, securing territories from Manchuria to Southeast Asia. These victories gave Japanese commanders confidence, sometimes overconfidence, in their tactical abilities and defensive strategies. Visual: archival footage of Japanese troops marching in formation, maps highlighting conquered territories. Japan's military doctrine emphasized fortification, surprise, and morale. Generals relied on heavily trained troops, intricate trench networks, and the belief that soldiers would fight to the death for the emperor. On paper, this strategy seemed sound, especially against conventional enemies. However, it failed to account for the full industrial might and technological innovations of the United States. Visual: Japanese generals studying maps, soldiers digging trenches, construction of pillboxes and bunkers. Meanwhile, the U.S. had transformed its military after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The American industrial machine was now in full swing, producing hundreds of ships, thousands of planes, and tens of thousands of weapons each month. By 1943, the Americans were deploying combined arms in unprecedented ways, infantry supported by armor, artillery, and naval bombardments acting in perfect coordination. Visual: pan over shipyards, assembly lines with tanks, planes being prepped, troops embarking on landing crafts. This growing disparity between Japanese planning and American production set the stage for the catastrophic battles that would soon follow. Japanese generals initially underestimated the speed and scale of American reinforcements. Reports reaching the command suggested numbers that seemed exaggerated. Fleets of ships, endless waves of tanks, and air support that could strike anywhere, anytime. Many dismissed these reports as propaganda or exaggeration. Visual: dispatches being read by generals, maps showing American positions, telegraph machines clacking. Yet the Americans had mastered a logistical system that allowed them to strike repeatedly, supply rapidly, and recover from setbacks with staggering speed. Their strategy in the Pacific was methodical. Each island captured was carefully mapped, reconnaissance was meticulous, and naval and air superiority ensured that Japanese positions could be targeted before a single troop even landed on the beach. Visual: animated maps showing sequential island hopping, arrows indicating troop movements, naval bombardments. On the Japanese side, generals focused on defending key strongholds. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, and later Iwo Jima were prepared as fortified islands with interconnected bunkers, trenches, and machine gun nests. Lieutenant General Keiji Shibazaki, for example, oversaw the construction of an intricate network of underground bunkers at Tarawa. Each bunker was strategically placed to cover the approaches and maximize the defenders' firepower. Visual: aerial view of Tarawa, diagrams of bunkers and trench systems, soldiers rehearsing defensive drills. Despite these preparations, the Japanese underestimated the Americans' ability to integrate air, land, and sea firepower seamlessly. U.S. commanders studied intelligence reports meticulously, calculating how many artillery rounds would be required to neutralize specific bunkers, which airstrikes would weaken defensive positions, and how armor could exploit gaps in Japanese defenses. This combination was something the Japanese generals had never experienced on this scale. Visual: animated sequence showing bombs hitting bunkers, tanks advancing, infantry moving in waves. Another critical factor was the scale of manpower. While Japanese forces were highly disciplined, they were significantly outnumbered in most engagements. For example, at Saipan in 1944, Japanese defenders numbered around 31,000 troops, while the invading American forces exceeded 71,000 Marines and Army personnel, supported by hundreds of aircraft and dozens of battleships. The imbalance in numbers was compounded by the Americans' ability to rotate troops, supply ammunition, and bring reinforcements almost instantly. Visual: comparison chart of troop numbers, shots of landing crafts arriving on beaches, aerial bombings. The geography of the Pacific also played a role. Many Japanese defensive positions relied on natural barriers, coral reefs, cliffs, and dense jungles. Initially, these were thought to provide strong defensive advantages. However, American tactics neutralized these advantages using engineering ingenuity and technological superiority. Landing craft could cross coral reefs, flamethrowers could clear jungle fortifications, and naval artillery could bombard positions beyond what Japanese defenders thought possible. Visual: slow motion of landing crafts navigating reefs, flamethrowers in action, artillery shells hitting distant positions. It's important to note the psychological factors at play. Japanese military culture emphasized honor and sacrifice, often leading to rigid adherence to defensive plans even in hopeless situations. Generals expected their troops to hold ground to the last man, relying on the morale and loyalty of soldiers rather than strategic withdrawal. This mindset, while admirable in discipline, left very little flexibility when confronted with overwhelming firepower. Visual: Japanese soldiers performing morning drills, writing letters home, praying at shrines. Meanwhile, the Americans applied what would later be called firepower dominance. Operation was designed to overwhelm defenders through concentrated artillery, repeated bombing runs, and massive naval gunfire. The scale and precision of these attacks shattered defensive positions quickly, leaving Japanese soldiers trapped and generals scrambling to adjust. By mid-1943, the reality was unavoidable. Japanese generals were facing an opponent whose combination of industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and relentless firepower could defeat even the most fortified positions. Communications from the front lines began to report shocking casualty figures, destroyed bunkers, and the inability to reinforce critical positions. Lieutenant General Kurabayashi noted in a confidential message, "Our assumptions about enemy capabilities are entirely inadequate. Every day we delay, their strength grows, and our defenses crumble." Yet, in spite of these warnings, Japanese commanders continued to prepare for battles as though the Americans were a conventional enemy. They fortified beaches, dug tunnels, and stockpiled ammunition. What they could not account for, and what would prove disastrous, was the Americans' ability to neutralize defenses before contact and bring overwhelming reinforcements. This background sets the stage for the dramatic confrontations that would follow. The Japanese general's shock was not a matter of being unprepared. It was the realization that their experience, courage, and meticulous planning were insufficient against the unprecedented firepower of the American military machine. Visual. Fade to a dramatic montage of both Japanese defenses and American firepower, maps overlaying troop movements, explosions. In the next chapter, we will explore the core battles, from Tarawa to Peleliu, where these generals' assumptions were obliterated and the human cost of underestimating modern firepower became tragically clear. You will see the tension, the chaos, and the moments when commanders realized their entire strategic understanding was no. Intense, pulsing dramatic music. The moment of truth arrived with the American landings on Pacific Islands, and for Japanese generals, it was a confrontation with a nightmare they had only imagined in reports and rumors. On islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, the Japanese defenders' meticulous fortifications faced a storm of American firepower so relentless it seemed almost unstoppable. Visual. Slow motion of waves crashing as landing crafts approach, soldiers bracing in bunkers, smoke rising in the distance. Tarawa, November 1943, became the grim proving ground. Lieutenant General Keiji Shibazaki commanded the Japanese forces, confident that his intricate network of bunkers and coral-based defenses would halt the American assault. Each bunker was strategically placed to cover approaches and maximize defensive fire. Soldiers rehearsed, dug deeper, and steeled themselves for the onslaught. Yet, even the most careful plans could not account for what was about to unfold. Visual. Animated maps showing Tarawa, bunkers highlighted, arrows indicating U.S. landing waves. At dawn, American forces began their assault. Landing crafts moved through coral reefs under fire, but pre-landing bombardments had softened the defenses far more than Japanese generals anticipated. Naval guns, coordinated artillery, and airstrikes struck the island in a symphony of destruction. Sandbags and bunkers that had taken months to build were obliterated in minutes. Visual. Explosions tearing through sandbags, soldiers diving for cover, bunkers collapsing. Shibazaki reportedly remarked, "Our positions, our strategies, they are being erased before our eyes. This is beyond anything we prepared for." Despite Japanese soldiers' courage, the sheer scale and coordination of American firepower left them disoriented and isolated. Visual. Close-up of soldiers shouting orders, clutching rifles, smoke and dust filling the air. Saipan, June 1944, amplified the horror. General Yoshitsugu Saito oversaw 31,000 defenders, facing an American force exceeding 71,000 troops, supported by hundreds of aircraft and naval ships. Japanese bunkers, caves, and tunnels were meticulously planned to inflict maximum casualties, but American combined arms tactics overwhelmed even the strongest positions. Visual. Panoramic shot of Saipan beaches, waves of American troops landing, planes flying overhead, ships bombarding the shore. Artillery fire was precise and unrelenting. Every attempt by Japanese forces to counterattack or regroup was met with concentrated barrages. Soldiers found themselves trapped between waves of infantry, naval gunfire, and bombs from above. Generals watched helplessly as positions they believed impregnable collapsed under a coordinated storm of destruction. Visual: close-up of soldiers in foxholes, explosions erupting around them, tanks crushing obstacles. One chilling account comes from Kurabayashi at Iwo Jima, months later. He observed his men fighting bravely, but facing a new type of warfare: firepower dominance. Flamethrowers, napalm, tanks, and artillery could reduce even underground bunkers to rubble. His diary recorded the bitter reality. No matter the courage, no matter the tactics, their guns can reach everywhere. Every tunnel, every position, every hope is under threat. Visual: tanks advancing through rough terrain, flamethrowers clearing bunkers, soldiers scrambling for cover. Even small units suffered catastrophic losses. At Tarawa, Shibazaki's forces had around 4,800 men, but within the first 76 hours, over 3,400 were killed, most under concentrated artillery and naval bombardment. The shock for generals was compounded by the fact that American firepower was both precise and adaptive, adjusting quickly to Japanese defensive movements. Visual: animated charts showing casualty numbers, waves of Marines advancing, explosions hitting bunkers. The human dimension amplified the horror. Soldiers who had trained for months, even years, were cut down in moments. Generals witnessed acts of heroism, men charging under fire to save comrades, holding positions against impossible odds, yet these acts could not stop the tide of firepower sweeping over the island. Visual: soldiers carrying wounded comrades, medics under fire, smoke and dust everywhere. Peleliu, September 1944, added a new layer of terror. General Kunio Nakagawa, defending the island, had reinforced positions with caves, underground bunkers, and concealed artillery. The Americans expected strong resistance, but they were still shocked by the level of coordinated defense and brutal losses inflicted by Japanese troops. Yet, even here, artillery, tanks, and air strikes systematically reduced the defensive positions. Visual: animated sequences of bunker networks being hit, smoke filling tunnels, soldiers engaging in close combat. Japanese generals repeatedly recorded their disbelief in communications and diaries. Words like unimaginable, relentless, and beyond comprehension recur in their accounts. They realized that their traditional doctrines, which relied on disciplined defense and terrain advantage, were insufficient. American forces combined speed, firepower, and tactical innovation in a way that rendered conventional defensive strategies obsolete. Visual: pan across destroyed bunkers, fallen soldiers, American troops advancing, generals watching. The psychological impact was immense. Commanders faced the impossible choice: continue defending hopeless positions, risking total annihilation, or attempt to withdraw and face shame in a culture that prized honor above life. Many chose to fight to the last man, a decision that cemented their soldiers' valor but guaranteed catastrophic losses. What made these battles particularly devastating for generals was the unpredictable and adaptive nature of American firepower. Each time a defensive position was neutralized, Americans advanced with speed, adjusted tactics, and exploited weaknesses. Japanese commanders could not anticipate every angle of attack or rate of bombardment. Their planning, meticulous though it was, collapsed against a foe that could think and strike simultaneously on multiple fronts, and yet, in the midst of this chaos, acts of extraordinary leadership emerged. Kurabayashi, Saito, and Nakagawa all demonstrated calm under pressure, reorganizing units where possible, rallying troops, and issuing orders in the midst of shellfire. Their words post-battle reflect both admiration for the enemy and sorrow for their losses. They fought with precision and honor. We fought with courage, but our hands were tied. These core events illustrate a painful truth. American firepower was decisive, overwhelming, and unforgiving. Even experienced generals, commanding elite troops and fortified positions, faced the stark reality that courage and planning alone could not overcome industrialized warfare. The shock they felt would be reflected in their later writings, a mix of awe, horror, and bitter hindsight. In this chapter, we've seen the battlefield as Japanese generals experienced it, Chaotic, deadly, and unpredictable, yet dominated by relentless American firepower. Their shock was real, their bravery unquestionable, but the lessons were cruelly clear in modern war. Overwhelming firepower could nullify even the most disciplined army. Visual. Slow fade to black, pan over destroyed bunkers, memorials, and maps marking fallen troops. Next, in Chapter 4, we will reveal the unexpected twists and shocking realizations that came after these battles, the confessions, regrets, and reflections of generals who understood too late just how unstoppable American firepower had been. Suspenseful music low, pulsing drums. The battles were over, the islands captured, and yet for Japanese generals, the shock had only just begun. It wasn't just the devastation or the staggering casualties, it was the realization that everything they had believed about American forces, their capabilities, and their strategies was fundamentally wrong. Only now, in the quiet aftermath of battle, did the grim truth settle in. Visual. Smoke rising from ruined bunkers, deserted beaches littered with debris, generals walking through devastated positions. Kurabayashi, the steadfast defender of Iwo Jima, reflected bitterly in his journal, "We had prepared for courage, discipline, and honor. We had not prepared for machines, for firepower that sees all, strikes all, and leaves nothing standing." This statement, penned in the shadow of defeat, reveals the gulf between expectation and reality, a gulf that cost tens of thousands of lives. Visual. Close-up of Kurabayashi's diary, overlay of explosions and collapsing bunkers. But the twist runs deeper. Many generals did not admit the true scale of American firepower until it was far too late. Reports sent during the battles understated the chaos on the front lines. Communications were sporadic, and the speed of destruction often outpaced the ability to convey information. Only after reviewing first-hand accounts, maps, and casualty figures did they fully comprehend the scale of their misjudgment. Visual. Letters and dispatches spread across a war room table, generals studying maps, overlay of casualty stats. General Keiji Shibazaki at Tarawa had meticulously constructed bunkers and fortified positions, believing these would withstand naval bombardments. Yet the Americans combined airstrikes, naval gunfire, and amphibious assaults in perfect coordination, systematically neutralizing defenses that Japanese doctrine assumed were impregnable. Shibazaki's posthumous notes would later reveal the bitter acknowledgement, "We fought as we had trained, yet our positions crumbled beneath the weight of unseen forces." Visual. Reenactment of bunkers collapsing under bombardment, soldiers scrambling, maps showing failed defensive lines. At Saipan, General Yoshitsugu Saito faced a similar revelation. Though his forces were larger, more disciplined, and well-prepared, the sheer scale of American logistics and firepower overwhelmed him. Japanese defensive positions were targeted with precision from land, sea, and air. Every maneuver, every attempt to counterattack, was anticipated and crushed. In his diaries, Saito wrote of the psychological torment of watching decades of strategy dissolve under waves of American troops and artillery. "We understood the enemy's courage, yet we underestimated their capacity. Our defenses were meticulous, theirs were relentless. By the time we saw the truth, it was too late to act." Visual. Panoramic shot of Saipan's beaches, U.S. troops advancing, artillery shells exploding, smoke rising. Here lies the twist. It wasn't merely American firepower that defeated Japanese forces, it was the timing of comprehension. Generals often only realized the true scale of the threat after witnessing the annihilation of their plans and troops. This is the cruel irony of war. Knowledge arrived when it could no longer save lives. Some attempted to adapt. Kurabayashi, anticipating that conventional defenses were no longer sufficient, implemented underground fortifications and decentralized command structures at Iwo Jima. Yet even these innovations could not match the Americans' firepower and coordinated assault. His strategies slowed the enemy, inflicted heavy casualties, and demonstrated ingenuity, but the ultimate outcome was unchanged. The twist, for him and many of his peers, was the realization that bravery and tactical skill alone could not overcome industrialized war. Visual. Tunnels, underground bunkers, flamethrower attacks, U.S. forces advancing through smoke. Nakagawa at Peleliu offers another perspective. His soldiers fought fiercely, employing caves, hidden artillery, and ambush tactics. American forces expected resistance, but the sheer relentlessness of combined assaults left Nakagawa stunned. His post-battle reflections describe a profound mix of admiration and horror. They fought with coordination and firepower we could not imagine. Even our most hidden defenses were exposed, destroyed, or bypassed. Their strength was something our training could not counter. Visual: smoke billowing from caves, tanks firing into fortified positions, soldiers firing from concealed bunkers. These twists were not only tactical but also personal and psychological. Generals faced the bitter truth that their decisions, however courageous or calculated, had directly led to the deaths of thousands of men. Many would carry this burden for the remainder of their lives, writing in diaries or giving post-war accounts that conveyed both admiration for American forces and remorse for their own mistakes. Visual: diaries being opened, hands trembling over written words, overlay of destroyed battlefields. Moreover, the twist exposed systemic flaws in Japanese military assumptions. Commanders had underestimated the scale of American industrial production, the speed of reinforcement, and the coordination between land, sea, and air units. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized honor and discipline, American strategy emphasized overwhelming, precise firepower combined with adaptive logistics. The result was catastrophic for the defenders. Visual: split screen showing Japanese bunkers versus American landing waves, artillery shells hitting defensive positions. Kurabayashi, writing later, summarized this bitter lesson. Experience cannot always prepare a man for the new face of war. We trained, we studied, we fortified, but the tools we faced were beyond any measure of preparation. Courage alone was insufficient. Visual: slow zoom on Kurabayashi's notes, overlay with explosions and soldiers falling. The twist, ultimately, is that the Japanese general's realization came too late. It was not only the loss of territory and troops that shocked them, it was the undeniable proof that their understanding of modern warfare was outdated. They had faced the unimaginable, and the only lesson left was regret, reflection, and bitter admiration for the capabilities of the American forces. Visual: montage of destroyed bunkers, abandoned weapons, solemn generals walking through ruins, smoke drifting into the sky. This chapter teaches us a profound lesson about war. Knowledge and timing are as crucial as bravery. Generals who could anticipate the enemy's movements but failed to grasp the magnitude of firepower were powerless to prevent devastation. Their words, recorded after the fact, resonate as warnings, confessions, and testimonies of the human cost of underestimating an enemy. Visual: pan over memorials, cemeteries, and diaries, overlay of dates and casualty numbers. As we move into the final chapter, we will see the lasting impact of these battles and revelations. The shock, regret, and lessons from these experiences would echo for decades, influencing military strategy, historical reflection, and the collective memory of one of the most brutal theaters in history. The final chapter will deliver the climactic emotional punch, leaving viewers to reflect on courage, hindsight, and the staggering consequences of facing overwhelming firepower. Dramatic orchestral music, slow build. The smoke has cleared. The beaches are littered with the remnants of fortifications, the coral scorched and broken, the sand stained with the cost of bravery. For the Japanese generals who survived, the battlefields were a grim testament to the power they had underestimated. The Americans had demonstrated a level of firepower, coordination, and persistence that was, for the generals, almost unimaginable. Visual: pan across destroyed bunkers, twisted metal, abandoned rifles, smoke drifting into the sky. Kurabayashi, Saito, Nakagawa, Shibazaki, names etched into history, would later reflect on their experiences with a mix of awe, remorse, and bitter acceptance. Their words, often penned quietly in diaries or whispered in post-battle reports, reveal the human toll of misjudgment, courage, and industrialized warfare. We fought as we had trained, yet the enemy's firepower was unmatched. Our men died with honor, but our strategy was insufficient. We learned too late. Kurabayashi. Visual. Close-up of handwritten diaries, overlay of black and white battle photos, flickering images of soldiers. The final punch of these battles was not only in the physical destruction, but in the lesson carved into history. Japanese generals realized that traditional tactics, courage, and discipline could not counter the overwhelming scale, precision, and adaptability of American forces. Every bunker destroyed, every soldier lost, every position overrun. These were proof of a new reality in modern warfare. Visual. Slow motion of collapsing bunkers, soldiers retreating under bombardment, ships firing from the horizon. Yet amidst the devastation, there were moments of valor and humanity that stand out. Soldiers fought with unyielding resolve, saving comrades, holding positions beyond reason, and adapting on the fly. Kurabayashi's decentralized command structure at Iwo Jima, for example, allowed pockets of resistance to continue long after the main lines were destroyed, inflicting casualties that stunned the Americans and inspired generations of military historians. Visual. Soldiers firing from concealed positions, medics aiding the wounded, small units holding ground under bombardment. But for the generals, these acts of bravery were bittersweet. They saw the immediate human cost, the thousands of lives extinguished, and knew that their strategic miscalculations had magnified the tragedy. Sato's reflections at Saipan are particularly telling. Our courage could not protect them. Our fortifications could not shield them. We had underestimated not only their weapons, but their will and coordination. The weight of that mistake rests upon us forever. Visual. Soldiers writing letters home, generals pacing ruined bunkers, maps marked with X's showing destroyed positions. This chapter of history leaves us with a chilling reminder. In war, timing, information, and adaptability can outweigh valor and preparation. Japanese generals learned the hard way that industrialized firepower, when combined with strategy and coordination, could overwhelm even the most disciplined forces. Their words, written after the battles, offer both a confession and a warning. Visual. Montage of destroyed landscapes, American forces advancing, Japanese survivors regrouping, smoke rising, yet history does not end with defeat. These battles, these reflections, shaped modern military thinking, strategy, and understanding of warfare. They underscored the importance of intelligence, adaptability, and respect for the enemy. Generals' admissions, recorded too late to save their men, became lessons for future generations. Courage alone is insufficient. Preparation must meet the reality of the enemy's capabilities. Visual. Close-up of generals' diaries, overlay of modern military exercises, archival footage transitioning to contemporary imagery. Even today, historians and strategists study these accounts not just to understand tactics, but to grasp the human experience of confronting overwhelming power. The shock, horror, and admiration expressed by Japanese commanders resonate as testimonies to the brutal realities of modern warfare. Visual. Pan over memorials, gravestones, abandoned equipment, ocean waves hitting the shore. As we reflect on these battles, one cannot ignore the unanswered questions that linger. What if the generals had known the scale of American firepower earlier? Could different strategies have saved tens of thousands of lives? Could islands like Tarawa or Iwo Jima have been defended more effectively? The answers remain speculative, yet the lessons are undeniable. Misjudgment in war can be catastrophic, and insight delayed is insight denied. Visual. Slow montage of maps, destroyed fortifications, general sketches, overlay of American landing sequences. And yet, the story is far from over. Across the Pacific, countless acts of heroism, strategy, and tragedy unfolded, some recorded, some lost forever. The general's words are only a fragment of a vast narrative, a glimpse into the human cost of firepower, courage, and miscalculation. Visual. Soldiers advancing, explosions in the background, close-up of Japanese and American troops in combat, fading into memorial imagery. For viewers, this chapter is both a conclusion and a cliffhanger. It leaves us asking, what other stories of bravery, misjudgment, and devastating firepower remain untold? How did these battles shape the outcome of the Pacific War, and what lessons remain relevant today? Visual. Fade to black, orchestral music swelling, teaser images for potential next videos, text overlay, the untold stories of the Pacific War. In the end, the words of these Japanese generals echo through history. We underestimated them and paid the ultimate price. The Pacific War was a collision of courage and industrialized firepower, strategy, and sheer destruction. It reminds us that in war, the most decisive battles are often won not by heroism alone, but by preparation, adaptability, and understanding the enemy, lessons written in the sand, soaked in sweat, and paid for in blood. Visual. Slow aerial view of the Pacific Islands, memorials, empty bunkers, fading into the channel logo. If you thought this account was shocking, prepare for even deeper stories, tales of soldiers facing overwhelming odds, leaders making impossible decisions, and battles that defied imagination. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover more truths from the Pacific War, where bravery met firepower and hindsight was the harshest teacher of all.